I'm Ken Porter. I'm director of UM Ventures College Park. Our group manages the intellectual property for the University of Maryland College Park. We're really happy to be here. I thank the organizers for inviting us and offering to give a different flavor for partnership, academic industrial partnerships. And in this panel, we'll be talking about, on the industry side, industries that we create ourselves, so social enterprises. Is this too loud? Anyway, so I'm Ken Porter. I'm really pleased to be joined on stage with friends of mine, longtime friends from Calgary, Alberta. First, Richard Ramsey. He was a professor of social work at the University of Calgary and started a social enterprise back in 1983 called Living Works, and it's still going strong, and it's truly a global social enterprise with headquarters in Calgary, in North Carolina, and in New South Wales, Australia. And it's a really interesting story to share with you. Next to him is Jordana Armstrong. Jordana is the director of the Social Innovation Hub at Innovate Calgary, and she supports students and faculty at the University of Calgary in creating their own social enterprises. And she'll give a couple of case studies of projects she's worked on, as well as share the infrastructure that she's created for the University of Calgary. Third, Ginger Jen is a professor of economics here at the University of Maryland, and she's co-founder of Hazel Analytics. Ginger won't be able to join us this morning, but she did send a video, and so sent recorded remarks, so I think that'll be instructive. Really interesting. We started this panel with 5 speakers, and we were worried that we wouldn't have enough time for everybody to tell their story, but in these COVID times, things change, and we're happy to be here, and happy to have 2 speakers that can have kind of an extended time to share their story. So I think we'll benefit from that. So I'll have a couple of opening remarks, we'll have the video, and then we'll have about 20 minutes each for Richard and Jordana, and then plenty of time for question and answer. So let's get started. So what is a social enterprise? And so a definition, maybe not the definition, is a corporation where social impact is core to the mission and profitability is core to the business model. So why do you do it? For impact and also for profitability, but sometimes I like to cross out profitability and substitute sustainability. So if you plow the profits back into the enterprise, then you can sustain the enterprise. So impact and sustainability, that's why we do this. And then a couple more definitions. So innovation is something new and useful, but in the social context, an innovation is a new idea, method, or device to create positive change, for example, in social, environmental, and cultural sectors. So innovation can be a noun. Innovation can also be a verb. And so the act of innovating. That's the act of dissemination and uptake of the innovation and demonstration of the impact on market and society. And the act of innovating can also feed back into the innovation and provide information that leads to a second round in the virtuous research cycle of coming up with a new and improved innovation. So in social realms, often referred to as community-informed research. And then the social enterprise, that's the vehicle, so the vehicle for innovation. An integrated impact and business model that enables the social innovation to be disseminated sustainably. So mission of the university is to create knowledge and disseminate knowledge. We create knowledge in the social sphere and can disseminate it through social enterprise. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And we'll let Ginger have the next word, and if we could cue up her video, please.
Hello, my name is Ginger Jen. I'm a professor of economics at University of Maryland, College Park. I'm sorry for not being able to attend the conference in person, but I really appreciate the opportunity to present Hazel Analytics. Hazel Analytics was founded in 2014 based on a decade-long academic research between me and my co-authors at UCLA, Stanford, and University of Maryland. As of today, Hazel Analytics is based in Seattle, Washington State, with 16 full-time employees. The targeted customer segment is retail food service, with a particular focus on retail food safety. We aim to improve public health through data-driven technology. In particular, we want to inform and collect all parties in this area, including food service operators, individual consumers, government regulators, and industry providers. We hope our data-driven technology can drive insightful action from all these parties. Exactly what's the problem we try to solve here? As you know, retail food safety is an important area of public health. In fact, it's so important there are over 2,500 health agencies throughout the U.S., typically located in local state, city, or county governments. These health agencies hire thousands of health inspectors. Each inspector can walk into an individual grocery store or individual restaurant on any day with some paper form like what I'm showing on the screen. The inspector can mark in compliance or out of compliance for many items related to food safety. Because the inspection could occur on any day at any food service outlet, it's quite tedious to collect individual inspection reports, especially for a chain that has multiple units operating across different jurisdictions. So that's the first layer of the problem, data fragmentation. The second layer of the problem is lack of standardization. Each health agency can adopt idiosyncratic regulation or idiosyncratic enforcement behavior according to the local situations. And that means it's pretty hard to understand the content of health inspection report, especially across different jurisdictions. The third layer of the problem is the massive scale. We have millions of food service outlets in the US. That means it's pretty hard to extract insights and ensure compliance, even if health inspection reports are readily available. To solve these problems, Hazel Analytics relies on data-driven technology. Because many large jurisdictions already publicize their health inspection reports online, we have created many data bots. Our data bots work around the clock to collect information from over 1,000 health departments in the US, Canada, and UK. Last year alone, we have collected over 1.8 million health inspection reports. That's about 5,000 a day. Once we have these health inspection reports, we ingest them into a standardized database. That means we normalize variables across different jurisdictions. We create standardized scoring and other numerical variables out of the free text in the raw data. On top of the database, we create easy-to-use enterprise software. This software includes intuitive dashboards, ready-to-use insights, as well as operational tools. Users can use these tools to manage food safety risk and regulatory compliance. This software has been used by many brands, including McDonald's, Starbucks, Chipotle, and Target. We developed the technology gradually. From 2003 to 2014, our academic research uses restaurant hygiene inspection records and look at public policy regarding disclosure of such information to the public. We find that consumers are sensitive to inspection outcome if these outcomes are salient and transparent to them. We also find that restaurant owners are willing to improve their hygiene condition once they know individual consumers can observe their inspection records. Our research further looked at how to standardize inspection database across the nation. These research were funded by the National Science Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Once we founded Hazel Analytics in 2014, we licensed IP from UCLA and University of Maryland. Based on this IP, we developed and released the first version of our food safety insight software. This software was able to attract notable food service brands as our direct customers. To maximize access to technology, we formed a partnership with Ecolab, which is a well-known publicly listed firm focusing on food safety. Ecolab launched Hazel-powered HDI program in 2017 and 2018. This allows hundreds of restaurant brands to use Hazel technology. In 2019 and 2020, Hazel entered the food delivery market by forming a partnership with Uber Eats. Hazel also partners with Yelp to produce consumer-facing products. In 2021 and 2022, Hazel released Corrective Action Workflow feature. This feature allows users to assign individual manager or individual employee to correct a particular violation. Hazel also released Predictive Analytics. These analytics allow users to be alerted of high-risk units and engage in proactive actions to prevent or correct violations. On March 31st of 2022, Yelp launched Hazel-powered health scores, which is accessible to millions of consumers in the US and Canada. As of April 2022, Hazel Analytics has made significant impact. On the software side, we have over 230 global and national brands using Hazel software that covers over 300,000 retail service locations. These users include 53 of the top 100 largest chains. Our users not only include restaurant chains, but also grocery stores, convenience stores, hotels, nursing homes, as well as food delivery platforms and online review platforms such as Yelp. On March 2022, the partnership between Hazel and Yelp has made health inspection data available in 48 states of the United States, up from only 4 states before Yelp formed a partnership with Hazel. This partnership has served nearly 70% of the US population. It also covers the Toronto and Vancouver areas of Canada. This is the brief story of Hazel Analytics. Hopefully it's a good example of how social science could be useful for the public. If you have any question, please feel free to reach out to me at ginger@hazelanalytics.com. You're also welcome to visit the company's website at hazelanalytics.com. Thank you so much for having me. I hope the conference will be lively and successful. Thank you.
For us, you talk about social enterprise, and it's a little bit, it's not a common everyday term. And you can talk about it in the abstract, and people say, I think I get it, but you see it in practice, and people say, oh, I get it, and I see how that could relate to my work. And Jordana and I were having exactly this conversation back about 2014 in Calgary about we thought that social enterprise was a great idea. And we had a heads up because of Living Works and Richard's work. So he showed us an example of an extremely successful social enterprise. And our thinking and his example, through our thinking and his example, we were able to communicate that message much better to the faculty and to the region, to the faculty, to the city, to the region in Alberta. And so Richard will tell you the story of Living Works, and then Jordana is going to give you a great overview of the infrastructure that's been built and from the kernel that Richard provided for us. So, Richard.
Thank you, Ken, and good morning, everybody. I don't know if you're like me, but this is an exciting time for me to be here in University of Maryland. This is my first trip in over 2 years. Most of my time in the last 2 years has been on Zoom calls and Zoom discussions, which is beautiful in terms of all the different kind of people that you can meet. But there's really nothing that really kind of tops the face-to-face. So I'm going to tell you a story that goes back into the early 1980s, and the story really starts with volunteers. University professor volunteers with a local mental health association, and a innovative idea that they had in the whole area of suicide prevention in terms of developing training that goes beyond just all of us trying to do our best, but to come up with something that might be standardized. That led us to the University of Calgary, or back to the University of Calgary, as 2 of us were professors, one in psychiatry and one in social work, asking the research part of the university at the time as to whether or not you can help us from the soft sciences or the social sciences with the idea and the project that we're working on. And the answer was no. We would like to, but we can't. But when the university developed a venture company, technology transfer company, University Technology International, then they were able to come to us and say, now we're in a position to invest. And we'd like to invest in your work. You now have a bit of a track record. And so that was the beginning of starting up a social enterprise that eventually was called Living Works Education. And our primary purpose is in the area of suicide prevention and to try and find a way to reach a broad audience in this area, public interest, public health or social health problem. And so that happened. And now I can also talk a little bit about the fact that Living Works Education now is an industry or part of the social science industry, and we have partnered in different kinds of ways with universities. So it's sort of a full circle type of story that I want to tell you this morning. So I can go to the next slide.
Oh, there's a clicker right there. If you put your hand down, you should find a clicker.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we are. Oops, how does that work?
Got it.
There we are. So we were asked initially to prepare 2 slides, and so I'm just going to speak to the 2 slides for a minute, and then I was looking at some of the work that's being done with the university industrial industry partnerships, and so I've added a few more slides to try and reach to that kind of context. But just briefly, it's a social enterprise that was founded in 1983 by 4 multidisciplinary mental health practitioners. We are incorporated as a company. Today, we have offices, head offices, if you want, as Ken mentioned, in Calgary, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and in Newcastle, New South Wales. And we're working in about 30 different countries in one form or another. And we currently have 58 employees worldwide. So we started with just 4 volunteers working off the side of their university desk by and large. And now we have 58 employees in different parts of the world. And one of the main things that happened to us, and we were starting to develop the program, was to find a technology transfer methodology that we could follow. And so the first thing we did was develop one out of our head. It was sort of an intuitive process. Then we discovered that a professor at the University of Michigan had received grant money to see if we could transfer industrial R&D over to social R&D for medicine, social welfare, education kind of programs. And that's what we learned about, and that became our platform to sort of bridge between bench research or knowledge generation research and program evaluation. We needed something in between to take the knowledge generation that came out of in this case, out of university research and out of other research studies that we were able to look at, and to build a transfer way to turn it into a practical application. And so the social R&D platform became extremely important for us in terms of following the phases that process had, from idea to development to large-scale dissemination. And it was the large-scale dissemination that was the big challenge, to see whether or not one could develop a program that eventually could be scaled out or scaled up into a larger dissemination. Proof, I guess, of that being possible is that we now have over 10,000 locally trained people in communities around the world. And we're serving, as I said a few minutes ago, in about 30 nations. So in terms of our impact, just to go over these fairly quick. Whoops. The numbers that we're working with now, in this last year, we still were able to train over 130,000 people during the year. Before COVID, we were training close to 200,000 people a year in different uses of our program. There's been about 50 or more peer-reviewed or government study reports, and on the international policy side, we were invited by the United Nations in the early 1991, to develop a policy guideline for national suicide prevention strategies. And we convened 15 people from 12 countries, and the UN template said that you had to sit down with the problem and come up with a solution, in other words, the guideline, in 7 days. So we brought everybody to the Rocky Mountains in west of Calgary and Banff, and beautiful sort of setting that we were in. We took those 15 people into the facility and locked the doors, basically, and said, you can look out the window of the beautiful mountains, but you can't go out until we're finished. So we managed to achieve that. And that particular draft that we did for the United Nations was brought back to the United States by one of the representatives who worked for CDC. He was also working with people in Atlanta that had to do with bereavement and suicide. And he gave this draft to one of the suicide survivors, who was a father who had lost his daughter, young physician daughter, to suicide several years earlier. He picked up that particular document and he said to somebody, I don't know who it really was, but he said, do we have one of these strategies in the United States? And the answer was no. And the research was academics and practitioners had tried several times to get a national strategy, and it didn't work. So guess what he said? He said, well, the people who are going to make something like this work are going to be the people who have been affected by suicide. So I am going to organize all the suicide survivors in the United States, and we're going to create a sort of a petition approach to Congress, and we're going to have a march next year on Mother's Day. And I thought, well, he was also a salesman, so I had a built-in bias about whether or not he might be able to accomplish that. But we were in Australia a year later on the Mother's Day week, and I got notice from somebody that said, I turned on the news last night in Australia, and I saw that there was some kind of march going on Capitol Hill in Washington. Do you know anything about that? And I said to myself, yes, I do. And to him, I said, yes, I do. And I sent an immediate message, ESP if I could, to the gentleman in Washington to say, please forgive me. I didn't believe you could do it, and he did it. And that was in 1996, and in 4 years, he created a suicide survivor social movement that brought about a national strategy in the United States in 2001. That's a pretty phenomenal sort of change over that period of time. The other thing that we worked with the National Suicide Prevention Line here in the United States, and we were able to work with Columbia University professors to do a SAMHSA-funded, NIMH-approved research design to do an outcome evaluation of what happened to the people who receive help through a crisis line. And it's the only kind of population with our kind of work that you can actually be with, if you want, the recipient of the intervention. most times you have no way of being able to watch what's going on in terms of an intervention. And so out of that study came the impact that the population compared to other people who were trained in different methodologies in the crisis line, this group that were trained in our program were less depressed, less overwhelmed, less suicidal, and more hopeful. It was the first and the only RCT that's been done in the world, I believe, on the recipients who received the intervention. Patient impact, one of the things that was interesting about that, a big health center in Toronto was trying to develop a suicide risk assessment tool, and it didn't work. So they finally went to the patients and the family members of the patients and said, how do we develop a suicide risk assessment tool? And the patients in a focus group said, well, most of the time when you clinicians talk to us about our suicide problems, you sound like interrogators. So if you want to do suicide risk assessment correctly, you have to do it inside a caring conversation. And it wasn't too much rocket science in that. But the hospital people went back to the project and said, so now what do we need to do? We need to switch from trying to develop a tool to an education and training approach. Where can we find somebody or some program that can meet the criteria of the patients? And they looked around, and apparently they phoned us at one point and said, we think your program organization can do this kind of thing. And so we started that kind of work with them, all tied into what the patient said would work. And so the other thing is that we've, through the RAND Corporation with our group in California, did some return on investment evaluations. And one of the results that they came out with is that for every $1,100, or for every dollar that is invested, society gains about $1,100. And on the 50-to-1, it was for every dollar the state of California invested in suicide prevention, they would get back $50. And finally, the other thing is that in suicide research, whether you go to the World Health Organization or you go to other researchers, the literature will tell you that you can't hold one program responsible for increasing or decreasing the rates of suicide. It's more complex than that. So whenever you read a research report that's measuring the outcome of a particular program, you'll see that in the literature review of the article. At the end, they will end up saying that this particular program did not reduce the rate of suicide. It's almost as if they forgot what they had written in the literature review part of the article. And of course, the unfortunate part about that is that most of us, when we read an article, we remember, in effect, the last paragraph, not the first paragraph. And so you have people going away and saying, well, none of these programs work. So what happened in Scotland and several other countries where they were able to measure a comprehensive approach to suicide, so training was one part, other things were being done. This is the kind of impact they had. Australia reduced its suicide rate by 20% over a 10-year period. It was reduced in Ireland by about 27%. The city of Glasgow in Scotland reduced their rate of suicide by, I think, over 40%. And the White Mountain Apache people here in the United States reduced theirs by, whatever the figure is there. I can't quite read it there for me, but so all of these results have shown that suicide can be impacted when you have a coordinated, collaborative sort of approach to it and not just relying on one particular kind of methodology. So just a little bit more about this story. The training development story for us started in 1983. We had our research questions were, is it possible to develop a standardized intervention training program like CPR, for example? If that's possible, can you disseminate it on a large scale? And if you can disseminate it on a large scale, can you quality control it once you have people out in the community doing it? So those are the three questions that we were challenged with. The problem behaviors at the time was that suicide, of course, is a serious public health problem in our country and other countries. We also knew that in the attitude literature, there was a question as to whether or not the attitudes of the helpers or the caregivers or society in general were actually antecedent causes to the actual cause of death. And so we were wanting to find out, are attitudes that powerful that they can actually impact a cause of death? We also knew that caregivers, whether they're professional caregivers or local care or natural caregivers, they didn't feel comfortable or confident or competent to be able to intervene with somebody. And the challenges we had were, can we increase the intervention effectiveness, and can we eliminate preparation inadequacies? Because there was some research that was showing that those who were helping professionals, when you asked whether or not you were dealing with suicide in your population, your client population, the answer was always yes. When you asked whether you were prepared to do that, the answer was no. Higher education did not teach us how to deal with this particular problem. So we had to turn it into a continuing education approach rather than a higher education curriculum approach. And so we designed a suicide first aid program that's similar to physical CPR. We built a standardized curriculum that had local applications, and we had to deal with the taboo subject of suicide. And all the literature on taboo subjects says you cannot just apply knowledge and skills training for people who are dealing with a taboo subject, whether it's sex education, suicide, whatever. So you had to build in a way in which you could get people to talk about their attitudes, and not so much in the way that a lot of us had experienced that now we're going to talk about attitudes. There's no right or wrong attitude. So please, let's get into a circle or table and talk about it. But unfortunately, almost every time when you get that promise, the shoe will drop somewhere in the process, and you will be told in one form or another which are the right attitudes and which are the bad attitudes. We wanted to stay true to that. If we promised you that there is no right answer, all we want you to do is explore your attitudes, that we would stay, our trainers would stay true to that, and then put them in a circle so that it was safe and supportive to talk about whether those attitudes worked for them or against them when they were actually trying to be helpful. And again, I'll just, the training development story with dialogue learning, field trials. We use the geometry work of Buckminster Fuller on to try and translate from a geometric understanding of shapes and forms into a social application, which we were able to do and develop this two-day, two-trainer program applied suicide intervention skills training, or ASSIST. We've done addition updates over the years, making sure that we're keeping up to date with the literature and other studies, and we've done significant adaptations in the Norwegian language and culture, Inuit language, and just go to that now. And the Aboriginal culture in Australia, the language and culture of the Inuit people in northern Canada, and South Korean language and culture.
Richard, I think that's amazing that you're able to disseminate your program, not just in English, but across cultures and across the world.
Yeah, so it's, and our university startup was with UTI, as I was saying. It's a transfer company, and as I mentioned, that we started with as volunteers, went to the university invested in us. We became a social purpose business model company. We've now survived almost 40 years, so we think we've at least established some element of sustainability. And now we've been working as an industry with other universities. Just to give you an example of some of your members, I mentioned Columbia University. We've worked with them. We're working with the Colorado State University. We did some work with them a few years ago. We're currently quite active with the Georgia State University Teachers College and some of the programs that they're doing, especially a Hope Lab that they've developed, where they're mentoring and mentoring students, small group of students, 12 or 13, and their own graduates who have done dissertation work. And one of the big things they did, we've been trying to break into the older population group in terms of suicide prevention. And when they first put in their grant applications, they were turned down because there is no evidence that this kind of gatekeeper or suicide intervention training works with older people. And of course, the response from the submitters was, well, that's why we are asking you for money. We want to prove that it, or disprove, that that's a possibility. Anyway, they made a number of changes, so to make that possible, they now have received one $700,000 grant and another $1.3 million grant. So they're on their way to do the research. Mm-hmm. So I'll finish up with that. There's more to it, but
well, I think that it's remarkable how you've been able to disseminate, create a program, an effective program, disseminate it, and then collect data, especially on the impact. And I think that's one of the real issues in social innovation. How do you know when you've done a good job, and when you can measure it and suicides prevented and lives saved? That's the ultimate way to measure impact. And I know Jordana has done a lot of work on, or put a lot of thought into how to measure impact and social innovation. And so, Jordana, do you want to start your story?
Sure, I will.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Ted, we were going to bother you to take a photo at some point because I'm having the opportunity to present with Richard, which is quite a pleasure for me. So good morning, folks. I'm Jordana Armstrong. I hope that I can keep your attention for 20 minutes and then we'll shift over to Q&A. I will be reading maybe a little bit more than I usually do because I wasn't able to attend the conference yesterday. And then I had some fantastic conversations with folks over the reception and sort of just wanted to get a little bit more of the story nailed down for the audience. And so sorry, Ted, I keep making these changes for you, but that's okay. So just starting by introducing myself, Jordana Armstrong, as Ken said, Director for Social Innovation at Innovate Calgary. I, prior to that work, was in what I would call the social profit sector. Sometimes we call them social purpose organizations. Sometimes folks call them nonprofits, but I don't like that terminology. I don't think there are many industries that are called a not something. And I really think that that sector stands for something and our language matters. Early career, I wanted to see direct impact in my role, so I found myself accidentally in what I now know today as startups. And what I mean by startups, and why I think it's important in this context of the title of the panel, is startups are really just an organization that's searching for a business model. And so when we think about startups, sometimes we think about Silicon Valley, Google, Amazon, but really it's an organization that's trying to figure out what sustainability means. And so for me, in terms of social enterprise, I think that really matters. As I said, early career, wanted to make direct impact in my work, and so found myself in small, nimble organizations where I could really get my hands dirty and sort of work at different levels. This includes working for the Canadian ambassador to the OECD on a startup think tank. Who knows what a startup think tank is, but I also worked with a charitable organization for a number of years, helping scale that up. We did entrepreneurship training for women artisans globally, really focusing on cultural preservation and women's economic empowerment. Then I found myself in the tech transfer world, and so at that point, they were looking for someone in social innovation. I thought I kind of knew what that meant. I was hired, and I spent the first 2 years completely fearful that people were going to figure out that I was a fraud, because I had no idea what commercialization meant. I mean, I understood the word, but not in that context. And I certainly didn't know anything about copyright or intellectual property. Spent a couple years trying to figure that out. And now, sort of 7 years later, we've really built an approach that I'm quite proud of that really sits at the intersection between information and knowledge that's being created in universities and sort of what I would think of as the social innovation space. Oh yeah, I have the clicker. All right. So just to talk a little bit more about Innovate Calgary. Innovate Calgary is a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Calgary. We report to the VPR, so we very much act like a department. Our brand kind of gives us a bit of trouble, though, because folks don't see us necessarily as the university all the time, but we get to wear multiple hats. So as a wholly owned subsidiary, we can be a little bit nimble, but we're still a department of the university. We serve students, faculty, and staff primarily, but we also, in particular through the Social Innovation Hub, which Ken mentioned earlier, and I'll have the opportunity to talk about this afternoon, through the Social Innovation Hub, are increasingly working with community organizations and social sector organizations that are interested in working differently with academic partners, also bringing foundations often to the table when we think about industry partnerships in that context. Who has the money? And so we like to look at sort of like a trifecta of relationships and help steward that. And then increasingly through the Social Innovation Hub, also working with folks that I would call change makers. And so these are people that are out there using entrepreneurial tools to try to make the world better in a particular way. And I think academic researchers are usually quite good at this. If you think about publications, teaching, transforming young minds, but also sitting on boards, advocacy, writing op-eds and papers. And so that kind of stuff influences media, influences culture, and we need that paired alongside the entrepreneurial mindset. So bit of a busy slide, but I just show this because we are kind of historically a tech transfer office, business incubation center. And so when I started, we had a lot of that language. We still use a lot of that language. The tech transfer industry has been around for 40-some years, perhaps, really prevalent since the 80s. And so there's a kind of a system of support that's been built up and a way of transferring knowledge in sectors like life sciences and physical sciences that's just known. So industry partnerships looks different. You have industry partners that have in-house licensing groups. But when you look at the social profit sector, it doesn't have that same sort of robust infrastructure. And so that's been something that we've been thinking a lot about is, how do we do this work differently, and how do we encourage more kind of partnerships and ways for academics to work differently with community? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? How do we do that work? Last year, University of Calgary was the #1 for startups in Canada, so we spun out the most amount of companies. I'm very proud to say that 75% of our portfolio are companies that are creating social impact. Now we're looking at measurement, and we can talk more about that this afternoon, but we look at that right now as companies that contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, so that's kind of across the gamut. But I'm pretty proud of that stat, and I think that's by nature of academic professors and researchers who are really trying to transform the world. Their startups that they end up spinning out are inherently startups that are trying to transform the world. And so like many tech transfer offices, we offer IP support, technology license and grant support, startup services around the gamut. And we've been really doing that as our core offering, like any tech transfer office, for the last kind of 5.5 years. Just this year, we recently received a pretty significant amount of money to then invest in scaling up those services through the Social Innovation Hub. And so it's allowed us to kind of add incremental or other types of programming and just really think differently about the knowledge translation pathways and how those are paralleled to the commercialization journey. And then we also recently launched a family of seed funds. So now we have the opportunity to again invest in companies like we were able to do in the past. So Richard's example is one example of a company that we were able to invest in. In the early days, we for a long time didn't have that seed capital, and that gap capital is really critical to help these things get, I call it, get legs at the very beginning. And I use that language very intentionally because it's really about creating organizational inertia. So again, going back to the definition of startup, it's not just about sort of the traditional for-profit, but it's about giving something legs or the ability to sort of live on beyond research funding. So Ken had asked us a question that he did, I don't know if he said it at the beginning, which was really then how does the commercialization or entrepreneurial journey affect kind of a researcher's trajectory? So I wanted to talk about 2 case studies. I'm going to start with Katrina Milani on the right, because this is a bit of a new kind of approach that we're dabbling in. And I know that Ken has done a lot of kind of thinking in this space as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about FICARE and dig a little bit more into Karen's story. So on the right, Dr. Katrina Milani, Associate Professor in the Cummings School of Medicine in the Community Health Sciences. A lot of her work is around vulnerable populations, including folks who are experiencing homelessness, effects of poverty, effects of domestic violence, mental health, addiction. I wanted to highlight her in particular because her work has been really about, her recent innovation or recent discovery was realizing that in southern Alberta, there's sort of a gap in terms of social service delivery for persons who are transitioning into homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And really what it was is that social service and community organizations are very much set up to deliver services to individual persons, largely males. But what was happening in southern Alberta is that the face of that was changing. It was largely single families, typically single mother families, and so things like transitional housing services didn't match. And so that was problematic. She was seeing this in the literature in her research, but she was noticing that there was this gap in terms of service delivery. And so as an academic would, her thesis was that we should start a research and policy hub. And so she came to us to actually say, well, how do I do this? Now, again, an organization just looking for a business model. There wasn't kind of direct core research involved in the project. It was really about community engagement. And so she was doing it on the side of her desk, as many of us do, and ended up working with us. We hired a student through a program that we run. I'll talk more about that again this afternoon, but love the opportunity to bring students together to explore early business models and to really dabble in what might be possible. The student used design thinking methodology, brought together over 50 stakeholders in the community, community leaders, foundations, government, to really kind of understand, is this potential solution solving the problem that we think that it's solving? Is this something that community needs or wants? And the answer after 4 months was, early signals that yes, that is the case. And so at that point, she then had enough kind of evidence to make a case to a local funder to invest in sort of seeding this initiative within the University of Calgary, which is really community-faced, again, not core research. And so the interesting thing to me about this is it just demonstrates that there are different models, but there are ways to use entrepreneurial thinking to create sustainability, as Ken said earlier, in initiatives so that they can exist beyond kind of core research. And a parallel that I want to draw between sort of any type of social purpose organization that's trying to get off the ground is likely you need a team. Likely you need some form of seed capital, and you certainly need some form of validation or understanding that your customer segment or your user segment or your beneficiaries actually do need and want this. And that's where I think there are really strong parallels between what's been developed in the entrepreneurial journey and sort of what we're trying to do in systems change, transforming systems social impact in those kind of spaces. As I said, the result was multi-year funding, which we're quite proud of. Still trying to figure out what our metrics look like to sort of have the VPR continue to fund us to do this work. But we're working that out, and that's part of sort of how we have to change our language, but also how we have to change our metrics to keep up with the type of work that we're trying to do. And then, so in going back to that question of how does this impact an academic's career? Well, for Katrina, in her exact language, it's the entrepreneurial thinking enabled her initiative to have direct community impact in a way that publications and conference presentations just could not. And so that was for her really important, and she no longer has to do that on the side of her desk because she's got 2 core staff who are able to kind of run that initiative. Karen on the left's case is a little bit different, much more kind of traditional social entrepreneurship. Karen is a serial entrepreneur. We've worked with her for many, many, many years. A lot of those years, Karen would say in the next slide, I'll wait for the next slide, but it's not always a perfect journey. But last 20 years, she's been studying individuals and community resilience and has been working with community partners to create and test and innovative solutions. Karen has been volunteering half a day a week at one of our local shelters to help them build evidence-informed ways of evaluating their programming, and has really been sort of a community engaged scholar at the get-go, but has realized that sort of for her, taking a step into entrepreneurship has allowed her to deepen her impact. So her most recent study, which I'll talk about and then I'll flip over to the journey, was Alberta FICARE, which looked at implementing a relational model of care within neonatal intensive care units in Alberta. So 30 years later, we're still figuring out that at the core, relationships in healthcare matter. But basically what our intervention was able to do is to build confidence for first-time parents to take their children home earlier from the NICUs by working with doctors and nurses to teach them how to work differently with parents. So a relational innovation that's really trying to change culture within the NICUs, demonstrated very strong outcomes from a research perspective, and so then received an investment from the Alberta government to scale and spread this across 14 NICUs in Alberta. So today, her journey looks a little bit different than Katrina's. She's a serial entrepreneur. I'll go to the next slide. So on the right was what I was going to say Karen would say about her entrepreneurial journey. But serial entrepreneur, as you can see from the dates, like she's been at it. She's got a number of different products. She's got different ways that she's thinking about really what she calls strengthening the liminal space in between relationships. So her company is called Liminality Innovations. All of her interventions are sort of in or around that space of building healthier, stronger relationships between families, healthcare practitioners in order to benefit children. She's benefited from some of our programs, worked with students to validate. She did our Catalyze program in 2018. Realized that there wasn't actually a market pull, so to speak, for her first intervention that she came to us with, Welcome to Parenthood, for a number of reasons. It was really the nonprofit sector that she was looking to serve wasn't a right fit. They didn't have the budget for what her intervention was at that time. FICARE, on the other hand, ended up having the type of market pull, we would call it, but the type of demand that made the initiative sustainable. But she's still looking at investing in Welcome to Parenthood. She's waiting for the opportunity when her company is more sustainable. She can actually use her profits to fund the deployment of that program rather than sort of spinning her wheels trying to do it on the side of her desk. I think that's a really interesting thought experiment. You know, we can do a lot of things with profit, but we can also reinvest in our impact. And so Karen's a great example of being able to do that and just being able to respond to sort of the pragmatics about her scenario. Apologies. Yeah, and I just want to say I'm super proud of this company because she's really gone from first prototype to first investment, and that's sort of the spectrum through which we're looking to support entrepreneurs. So just in the interest in time, and because I have a little bit more time to talk about this afternoon, I think I will just say that we've been able to incrementally, kind of starting with just working, I'm going to have to grab a water, incrementally just starting with working with a couple of researchers. We've been able to go from sort of one-off relationships with folks to really investing in a whole system of supports, and that's really driven by the faculty and the entrepreneurs that we're working with, because they are able to demonstrate outcomes in their work, like the outcomes that Richard talked about in his story. I think academic researchers serve the social profit sector well because you look at things through an evidence lens. And so you're able to bring credibility to your interventions and bring credibility to the impact that you're trying to create. And that's really powerful, and that's where the traditional social profit sector really, really struggles. So yeah, today we work with over 100, we've worked with over 100 entrepreneurs in the social sector, and represent 8 faculties across campus through a model that I can kind of expand on a little bit later. So last 2 slides here. Oh, yeah. This is confusing. I won't do this again. So startup development phases. The reason I put this up is because I kind of already mentioned folks that have been doing tech transfer and entrepreneurship development for quite a long time. And so while this is an imperfect model, there sort of has become a system of support. There's become literature. There's become approaches, tools, techniques, and all of these things kind of can help advance a project along. This is something that all of the innovation organizations in Alberta use through the Calgary Innovation Coalition, but it's a framework that's been built in Helsinki, and it's kind of utilized in sort of ecosystems around the world. But it really gives you a sense of sort of at a particular phase, there are different ways of characterizing what you're doing and what you might need to do next. And it's really that commitment at that 0. That's the space that we're really interested in. So how do you, in a social purpose context, commit to moving on to the next phase? In a startup, that looks like founding the company. In a nonprofit, that might look like founding the entity. What does that look like in a collective impact context? What might that look like when we think about how we scale policy change? And so those are some of the questions that we're grappling with. And again, I think a place where social science researchers really can drive innovation and using kind of entrepreneurial thinking and sort of startup methodologies to do so. And then the last slide, this is just something, talk about imperfect models. This is very imperfect. We are only starting to build this now. So this is sort of a glimpse into what we're trying to do in the future. And this is just, like I said, taking that startup pathway and then trying to adapt it in a context that works for people who are promoting social change in different ways. So using entrepreneurial thinking, to think about what the phases are. And this might look like things like MOU templates. So I was talking about this with someone yesterday, like how do you do a community-facing terms of reference or a community-facing MOU to create buy-in from stakeholders that you're trying to engage? So we're trying to build out kind of tools and tactics along this journey to help illuminate the pathway in some ways. We'll be sharing, Ken's team has already kind of started to jam on this a little bit with us, and so it's something that we're hoping to share with other tech transfer offices and kind of continue to co-create. And then I'll just leave you with some kind of key learnings for me in this journey and sort of key learnings for us as an organization. First, I think the goals of tech transfer start to shift when we think about social enterprise. And therefore, as I kind of already alluded to, our language and our metrics also have to change because the faculty's goals may be different. Sometimes, not always, but certainly that dual kind of impact first financial sustainability it can be sometimes unique. Again, I alluded to this, but working with students is a really powerful way to explore early sustainability of a particular initiative or venture, especially when it's on the side of your desk. It's a wonderful opportunity for students to get hands-on in entrepreneurship without having to be the founder, which is a lot of pressure. But it also gives you the opportunity to sort of validate your ideas and have someone else sort of co-create with you. But that takes a little bit of being able to bring that person in as a partner and sort of see yourselves as equals in different ways because you're bringing different things to the table. Really importantly, what we're seeing with our faculty is increasingly donors, especially private individuals, but increasingly foundations, are asking about sustainability plans. So folks are now coming to us because they have to write a business plan. And if you just write a business plan, that's as good as, you might as well throw it out. It's really about validating a plan for business, and that's sort of what we are trying to do through some of these frameworks and approaches. But at the end of the day, it's sometimes very much donor-driven, but it does help faculty think about sustainability, as I've talked about, kind of post the research process. The other piece, the innovation journey is not a clear path, so this is false, but there are tools, tactics, approaches that can be leveraged, and I talked about that. And then last 2 points, I do think the core competency of intellectual property management, core competency of understanding the founder journey, and core competency of project management are really important skills that equally apply whether you're looking at commercialization in the hard sciences or soft sciences. So really important to think about, and certainly something that your tech transfer office offers. And then lastly, I think the other offering, which is really important, is the role of coach, just having someone in your kind of on your side of the ring while you're trying to explore these things seems to really matter, and those connections to sort of networks beyond your own. So I will leave it with that, and we'll have more opportunities to talk about the Social Innovation Hub later.
Thank you, Jordana. Yeah. Thanks to Richard and Jordana for inspiring examples of social enterprises, social entrepreneurship that started with academic research, and this is a method for impact, a method for knowledge dissemination. But Richard, we've been looking at it kind of from the inside out, from the university to the community. But how about looking from the outside in? And Richard mentioned that in looking at his impacts, several approaches to suicide prevention were studied, but his living works was the only one that showed any effect. And so the academics have an advantage in social enterprise because the core competency is backed by academic rigor. So you know that it works. You know that if you follow your method that you've developed in your university research, that you'll get predictable results. And but how do you get that out to the world? You can write a paper on it, but can others do it? And Richard mentioned the Rothman method, very much like the scientific method, where you identify a problem, you generate a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, and eventually you arrive at a solution. But in the social sciences, you don't stop there. The next steps on the Rothman method are to take that solution and to package it such that others can deliver it and achieve the predictable results. And so that's the tough part in going to the scaling. I was on a call yesterday with a tech company, and they had beautiful demonstration projects at the lab scale. But the world wants it at an industrial scale. And so taking that leap is really what the social enterprise has to do. And that's what Richard's company, Living Works, has done so well. Is how do you scale it? How do you scale your solution? And train the trainer is a very common approach to that scaling, and Living Works has that down to an art. And so, Richard, you mentioned you have 10,000 trainers worldwide, and so you're able to bring lots of folks into the fold. But how do you preserve the fidelity so that you'll get the predicted results? So that's something that, so I'm asking you that's a question. So you have materials, it's kind of like licensing these trainers, and then also continuing education, I would imagine. So maybe you could address that question.
Well, quickly on that, one of our trainers or founders always said he's not very good at math. So his response to a question like that was something like, well, it's 50% of the audience, 50% of the manual that gives the instruction, and 50% of the trainer that's doing the instructing. And so they said, well, wait a minute, that adds up to 150. And his reply was, yeah, but the reason this training works is because usually 2 out of those 3 are working in sync. So sometimes you've got an audience from hell, but the manual and the trainer is working well. Sometimes you have a trainer that forgets what they're supposed to do, and the manual and the audience do it. And so that was his 150% answer to that question. But,
Jordana, when you're looking at all the different models and the startups that you do, so is train the trainer the most prevalent approach for dissemination?
Actually, like increasingly folks are using online modules and kind of online paired with train the trainer, but I think direct dissemination, I think because of just the way that digital technology is changing, has become more and more increasingly. But I will say that the train the trainer model, it seems hard to compare in terms of preserving that fidelity.
So can we just have a question in the audience,
Sure.
if that's okay?
Thanks, Ted. My question is actually for Jordana, but I did want to, just for Richard, when you talked about the stigma of suicide and how to, ways to, anyway, that made me think about Logic's song about the suicide prevention hotline and how that's brought awareness to an entirely different group of people that wouldn't normally think about it, talk about it. Anyway, wanted to bring that up. He's a Maryland native. His producer is a UMD alum, so I had to mention that as well. But my question is for Jordana, and this is not just for universities, but any organization. As I'm thinking about this, for anybody who wants to do something for social good, where it's not apparent how it connects to dollars at some point, whether it's grants, whether it's revenue, whatever. This is something that we all probably run into somewhere or another. So how do you get the resources, staff, and support? That's a challenge. And my guess is you practice design thinking, lean startup, partnerships, collaboration. So you beg, borrow, and steal slices of people, slices of time, slices of existing units where they're willing to pitch in and help. But which are the pieces that you find you cannot beg, borrow, and steal, that you have to have full dedication? I mean, you're clearly one of those people. I assume that 100% full-time on this. But what are the pieces where you need people who are full-time, all their mind share is dedicated toward this? So you like, who are those people?
Can I just ask a clarifying question? In terms of who those people are you asking what's absolutely necessary in the pie in terms of what you beg, borrow, and steal? Or are you asking like what kind of people are needed to kind of pursue entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I assume when you first started, you had yourself and you cobbled together a whole that's greater than some of the parts by beg, borrow, and steal.
Right,
but what were the
right,
pieces
right,
where you
right.
identified, I now need a dedicated X, Y, or Z with me because the pieces I'm cobbling together are not sufficient to get to where we want to go?
Yeah, I understand. One, context specific, but I think I understand the context that you're getting at. To make it a little bit more general first, it's a hard question to answer, but what is the next best step? One of the best pieces of advice that one of our serial entrepreneurs ever gave a startup founder, and I happened to be there and just felt grateful to have heard that advice, but the most important thing for an entrepreneur is what rises to the top of their to-do list, because there are a million different things that you could be doing. And I think similarly, to me, entrepreneurship is about trying to do something new in a resource-constrained context and needing to figure it out. Like, that's really simply what it is. And so I think what you're talking about very much is perhaps intrapreneurship, which is a concept that we use a lot. And so I think it's context-dependent, but it really is about sitting down with the key stakeholders that you could identify, whether they're folks on your team, external to that. What is the best next nut to crack in this context in order to get to the next place? What I mean by that, that's exactly the question you have to ask around validation, right? Because you can't validate everything at once. And that's another thing that new entrepreneurs often make the mistake around, is you're trying to sell to the healthcare system and to teachers associations and to parents. Well, it's really hard to validate those markets. So you really have to focus, validate, move on, focus, validate, move on. In our context at Calgary, because of the economic downturn, a lot of folks were investing, a lot of funders were investing in youth reskilling. And so we had that opportunity. For us, the next nut to crack was, let's get a small amount of funding to bring some students on to work with faculty. But that was context specific for us.
So we've got time for one last question, and it's right over here.
I'm just going to make a quick comment to this one, that one of the things that we feared in terms of selling was selling to ourselves, and that had to do with putting a price on what it is we were selling, and we were scared to. So we started out in the pay what you feel like paying, and then eventually it got to be, we're going to charge $5, but you don't have to pay the $5. And eventually we got to a price that said, that's the price, you pay it or you don't, kind of thing. And so that was a big transition for those of us out of the sort of social sciences kind of background and field.
Correct.
Thanks. I'm Barry Costa. I run MITRE's Tech Transfer Office, MITRE Corporations. And Jordana mentioned metrics, and I hate to get into metrics, but how do we measure either the ROI or track the metrics associated with this? Because it's not easy. I mean, money's easy to track, but we're not talking about money here. How are you guys thinking about measuring that? Richard exactly measured it, so I see that. So Jordana or whomever would like to take this question.
Yeah, so the two key metrics we had, which are imperfect, lots of stuff in this is imperfect. Net new researchers engaged. So researchers that we hadn't been able to work with before, because tech transfer has been around for a long time. Folks who are in the hard sciences, who are innovative, are typically working with the tech transfer office, so that's one. And then faculty is represented. And then we were looking, we're telling stories about the impact that folks are creating, but now we're trying to move away from stories to the current imperfect system is self-reported impact measures, but we've developed an impact measurement bootcamp that's easier for faculty and entrepreneurs to leverage so that we can start to standardize some of those impact measures and look at how that aggregates up to the portfolio. Right now, using the Sustainable Development Goals as the framework to aggregate the data up, but that doesn't work that well either. So it's a tricky space, but it's net new researchers. And then, like I said, in the Katrina Milani example, trying to sort of proxy and sort of accounting for our impact in that entrepreneur's journey, like without Innovate Calgary, what wouldn't have happened, and then how do we, so the cash that she brought in to start the Institute, for example, was one that we had to tell a story around but didn't quite have a hard metric.
Thank you. Thanks, Ted. And thanks, Jordana and Richard, for inspiring talks. Thank you.